bringing back my top videos. If you missed these or want to relive the best moments, let me know your fave.
Reality, as we know it, might be completely wrong. New research into quantum physics and consciousness suggests that our thoughts literally shape the world around us. And today we're exploring a revolutionary framework that explains exactly how this works.
The way this connects to quantum mechanics is fascinating. When we look at Vadim Zeland's reality transfer thing, it aligns perfectly with what scientists are discovering about observer effects and parallel possibilities.
You know what's really mind-blowing? He introduces this concept of pendulums, massive energy structures created by collective thought that actually feed on our emotional reactions. Think about how social media algorithms work. They're literally designed to trigger these emotional responses.
That's exactly what caught my attention. The way he describes these pendulums mirrors what we're seeing in studies of mass psychology and social contagion.
Here's where it gets practical. Instead of fighting these pendulums, he suggests something counterintuitive. It's like psychological aikido. You simply step aside and let the energy dissipate.
The research on emotional regulation supports this approach. Could you explain how this works in real world situations?
Well, imagine you're dealing with an aggressive colleague. Traditional advice might tell you to stand your ground, but Zeland's approach, backed by conflict resolution studies, shows that neutralizing the energy often leads to better outcomes. Studies show that non-reactive responses reduce workplace conflicts by up to 70%.
Let's talk about how this connects to his concept of excess potential. The idea that putting too much importance on things actually creates resistance.
The neuroscience here is fascinating. When we obsess over outcomes, we activate the amygdala's stress response, literally creating biological resistance. Research shows that reduced attachment to outcomes actually improves performance by up to 30% in high-pressure situations.
The way he describes the wave of fortune reminds me of flow state research. How do these concepts align?
Exactly. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow states shows remarkable parallels. When we're in flow, we're riding what Zealand calls the wave of fortune, the optimal state where action becomes effortless. Studies show people in flow states are up to 500% more productive.
That brings up an interesting point about these mental slides we create, these filters through which we view reality. Recent cognitive research has something to say about this, doesn't it?
Oh man, the latest neuroplasticity studies are wild. They've shown that our mental filters literally shape our neural pathways. That famous experiment with kittens he mentions. Scientists have now replicated similar effects in human perception studies.
The implications for personal development and psychological well being are pretty significant.
Well, consider this. Studies show that people who practice what Zealand calls outer intention report 40% lower stress levels and 60% higher life satisfaction scores. It's not just philosophical, it's measurable.
How does this connect to the emerging research on consciousness and reality?
The double-slit experiment in quantum physics shows that observation affects reality at the particle level. Zeeland's framework suggests this happens at the macro level too. Our consciousness literally shapes our experience. Recent studies in quantum biology are starting to support this view.
That's fascinating how modern science is catching up to these ancient wisdom traditions.
And here's what's really exciting. Researchers at major institutions are now studying these consciousness-reality interactions. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research PEER program found statistical evidence that human intention can influence random event generators.
The practical applications seem endless. What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the research shows three main things. First, reducing emotional reactivity improves outcomes by up to 40%. Second, maintaining what Zealand calls coordinated intention increases goal achievement by 65%. And third, this is crucial, people who practice these principles report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction.
The data really backs up what initially seemed like abstract concepts.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so powerful. We're not just talking about philosophy anymore. We're seeing measurable results in psychology, neuroscience, and even quantum physics. The evidence suggests that reality is far more responsive to our consciousness than we ever imagined.
So, what's the next frontier for this research?
Scientists are now using advanced brain imaging to study how intention affects neural patterns, and the results are promising. We're starting to understand the literal mechanics of how consciousness shapes reality. Until next time on Gen FM, keep exploring those quantum possibilities.
Reality feels like this solid, unchangeable thing we can all agree on. But quantum physics is showing us something completely mind-blowing. Our consciousness might actually be creating the world around us.
You know what fascinates me most about this? The way quantum mechanics is starting to overlap with neuroscience. The double slit experiment really turned everything we thought we knew upside down.
Let me break this down because it's absolutely crucial to understanding how deep this goes. When scientists observe particles in this experiment, they behave completely differently than when they're not being watched. It's like the act of consciousness itself is changing physical reality.
That's exactly what I was thinking about. How do we explain that observation literally changes the behavior of matter at its most fundamental level?
Well, here's where it gets even more interesting. Recent studies in quantum biology are showing that our DNA and neurons might be operating on quantum principles. We're not just talking about some abstract physics experiment anymore. This is happening inside our own bodies.
So you're saying our thoughts could be directly influencing physical reality at a cellular level? That's pretty revolutionary.
And the evidence keeps stacking up. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Program found that human intention could actually influence physical systems. They ran tests for nearly 3 decades and found statistically significant results showing people could affect random number generators just by thinking about it.
That reminds me of that groundbreaking 2017 study where they found people's brainwaves would shift before they even started problem-solving tasks, almost like their minds were reaching into the future.
Exactly right, and this ties directly into what neuroscience is telling us about neuroplasticity. Every single thought we have is literally rewiring our neural pathways. We're not just passive observers, we're actively constructing our reality moment by moment.
How does this connect to Vadim Zeland's concept of mental slides? Because I see some fascinating parallels there.
Well, Zeland's work suggests that the more you rehearse a desired reality in your mind, the stronger those neural pathways become. And now we have the neuroscience to back this up. Studies show that visualization actually creates the same neural patterns as physical practice.
That makes me think about the implications for success and achievement. If our thoughts are literally shaping our reality, wouldn't that mean we need to be incredibly careful about what we focus on?
That's precisely where the research on pendulums comes in. These massive energetic structures created by collective thought. Think about how social media algorithms work. They're not just reflecting reality, they're manufacturing it. Studies show that emotions like fear and outrage can spread exponentially through these networks.
So what you're saying is that by engaging with these negative thought patterns, we're actually strengthening them.
Exactly. And here's the fascinating part. Research in emotional regulation shows that non-reactive responses can reduce workplace and social conflict by up to 70%. It's like psychological Aikido. Instead of fighting against something, you simply step aside.
That's really interesting because it connects to what we know about stress and performance. When we are too attached to outcomes, our amygdala gets triggered and performance can drop by up to 30%.
And the flip side of that is equally fascinating when people enter what's called a flow state, where they're fully engaged but not attached to outcomes. Their productivity can increase by up to 500%. It's like tapping into what Zeland calls the wave of fortune.
So how do we actually apply these principles in practical terms? What are the concrete steps people can take?
Well, the research points to 3 main approaches. First, spend 5 minutes every morning using mental slides, vividly imagining your ideal reality. Studies show this increases goal achievement by 65%. Second, practice stepping aside from pendulums, and when you feel emotionally hijacked, pause instead of reacting. And third, train yourself to take action without over-attachment to results.
That reminds me of the research on elite athletes. When they focus on process instead of outcomes, their performance improves by about 30%.
Exactly. And what's really exciting is that we're just scratching the surface. The latest studies in advanced brain imaging are starting to uncover the actual mechanics of how consciousness influences reality. What we once dismissed as mysticism is now being studied at leading research institutions.
So where do you see this field heading? What's the next frontier?
The implications are staggering. If our consciousness is actively shaping reality rather than just perceiving it, it completely changes how we think about personal development, education, even therapy. Some researchers are already exploring how these principles could revolutionize mental health treatment.
That's fascinating. It's like we are discovering that we have this incredible power that we've been using unconsciously all along.
And now that we're becoming aware of it, we can start using it intentionally. The research suggests that understanding these principles alone can increase positive outcomes by up to 40%, simply because people start paying attention to how their thoughts shape their reality.
So what you're saying is that this isn't just theoretical, it's something people can start applying right now to improve their lives.
Absolutely right. And the beauty is that it doesn't require any special equipment or training. It's about becoming aware of how our thoughts and focus shape our experience, and then making conscious choices about where we direct our attention.
That's really empowering. It puts the power back in people's hands.
And that might be the most important takeaway from all this research, that we're not just passive observers of our lives, we're active participants in creating our reality. The question is, how will we use that knowledge? You know what's fascinating? The idea that our own consciousness might be the creative force behind everything we experience. Today, we're exploring a radical perspective that turns traditional spirituality on its head.
That's quite a bold claim to start with. How does this perspective actually work in practice?
Well, imagine consciousness as being like empty space. It has no form itself, but gives form to everything within it. The author uses this metaphor to explain how our awareness shapes reality.
So in other words, our basic sense of I am or existence is what creates our experience.
Exactly right. And here's where it gets really interesting. The text explains that the one thing all humans have in common is this awareness of being. It's what some call God, but it's actually our own consciousness.
That's pretty mind-bending when you think about it. How does this relate to people's everyday experiences?
Well, take something simple like feeling wealthy versus feeling poor. The author argues that whichever state you're conscious of being will automatically express itself in your reality, just like water takes the shape of whatever container it's in.
But surely external circumstances play a huge role in our experiences too.
That's where this teaching becomes really radical. It suggests that what we see as external circumstances are actually projections of our consciousness. There's this fascinating quote, "You eternally objectify that which you are conscious of being."
So if someone wanted to change their circumstances, they would need to change their consciousness first rather than trying to change things directly.
Exactly. And here's a powerful example from the text. It's like a sculptor who sees the finished masterpiece already existing within the marble. They don't create it. They reveal it by removing what's hiding it.
That's quite a beautiful metaphor, but how does someone actually put this into practice?
Well, the author gives specific techniques. One is what he calls spiritual circumcision, removing the veils of identity like race, nationality, family roles that limit our sense of pure awareness.
You know what's interesting about that? It reminds me of modern psychological concepts about letting go of limiting beliefs.
Right? And he takes it even further with biblical metaphors. He reinterprets the crucifixion as consciousness being nailed to a new concept of self, and resurrection as that new identity coming to life.
That's such an unexpected interpretation of those religious symbols. What about people who struggle with negative self-concepts?
The text addresses this directly with what he calls the law of consciousness. To him that hath, To him shall be given. It means whatever state you're conscious of being will multiply and express itself more fully.
Well, that could sound pretty harsh to someone who's struggling.
You raise a good point, but here's the empowering part. It means anyone can change their experience by changing their consciousness. The author emphasizes that this power is equally available to everyone.
That makes more sense. What about the role of time in all this? Does it matter how long it takes to see changes?
This is one of the most fascinating aspects. The text argues that time is essentially an illusion. The key is to feel your desire as already fulfilled now, rather than projecting it into the future.
That seems like it would be really challenging for most people to do.
It definitely requires practice. The author suggests starting with small things to build your confidence. He gives an example of feeling the naturalness of having something before it appears physically.
Speaking of practice, what specific techniques does he recommend?
The main technique is what he calls I am, catching yourself whenever you say I will be or I want to be, and shifting to I am in the present tense. He says this aligns you with the creative power of consciousness.
That's quite different from typical goal-setting approaches that focus on future achievements.
Absolutely right, and here's why that matters. When we're always projecting our desires into the future, we're actually affirming their absence in the present. It's like telling consciousness, I don't have this now.
That really shifts how I think about the whole manifestation concept.
And there's another crucial aspect, the role of feeling. The author emphasizes that it's not enough to just say the words I am. You have to feel the naturalness of being what you desire.
That reminds me of recent neuroscience findings about how emotion helps encode new patterns in the brain.
Interesting connection. The text actually anticipates a lot of modern scientific insights about consciousness and reality creation. He was writing this in 1960, well before many of these ideas became mainstream.
What about dealing with setbacks or when things don't seem to be working?
The author addresses this directly. He says what appears as failure is often just a misunderstanding of the law. If we react to appearances, we perpetuate them. The key is maintaining the feeling of the wish fulfilled despite appearances.
That takes real mental discipline.
It does. And that's why he emphasizes starting with small things to build your confidence. Think of it like building a muscle. You start with lighter weights before trying to lift heavy ones.
Looking at the bigger picture, what do you think are the implications of these ideas for society as a whole?
Well, if consciousness really is the fundamental creative force, it suggests that collective transformation starts with individual transformation. Change your consciousness, change your world.
That's quite a powerful message to end on.
Indeed it is. And perhaps the most important takeaway is that this power isn't something we need to acquire. It's what we already are, just waiting to be recognised and used consciously.